Thank you.
Nice to see you all here today. My name is Corey Gooding. I'm a graduate student in the Political Science Department and alum of the Master's Program in Afro-American Studies. And I have the honor and pleasure of being able to introduce Janira, which is awesome. Talk about an emerging scholar. So Janira is a doctoral candidate in the Department of History here at UCLA, and she's currently working on her dissertation, I Too Am America: Migrations, Identity, and Citizenship in Black New York City, 1890s to the 1930s. Her research interests includes 19th and 20th century African American history, urban history, and Black migrations and immigration. She is the recipient of the competitive fellowships and research grants from the University of California, Los Angeles, and she's published in the Journal of African American History. She's also an extraordinary friend and a great person, which I like to highlight, and it's my pleasure to introduce Janira Teague.
Thank you for that introduction, and thank you all for coming today. I especially like to thank Alex Tucker and the Bunche Center for allowing me to have this opportunity to talk about my dissertation. Okay. I Too Am America claimed the African-American literary artist Langston Hughes in his Harlem Renaissance era poem. Throughout the early 20th century, Hughes lived in New York City, which held an ethnically diverse Black population of African Americans and Black immigrants from the Caribbean. According to historian Irma Walken Owens in her important work on the heterogeneity of Black Harlem, between 1900 and 1930, some 40,000 immigrants of African descent, most of them from the British-held colonies of the Caribbean, settled in Harlem as it was emerging as a Black community in New York City. This settlement converged with that of African American migrants from the states of the southeastern seaboard and elsewhere. In total, over 100,000 British Caribbean immigrants settled in the United States. While the size of their immigration pales in comparison to the European and Jewish movements to this country during the early 20th century, and was substantially smaller than the Great Migration to the North during the World War I era, Black immigration during the early 20th century was significant, and its participants profoundly shaped Black politics and culture, especially in New York City, as well as defined ultimately what it meant to be and become African American. This presentation, with its focus on culture, politics, and becoming African American, is a small component of my doctoral dissertation, which is still very much a work in progress. The major research question for my dissertation is, how did the parallel migrations of African Americans and British Caribbean immigrants to New York City and their subsequent interactions lead to the development of new economic and political identities, as well as shape the meaning of African American? Therefore, my research specifically describes changes in the migrants' identity and citizenship status, as well as changes in their intellectual ideas regarding identity, citizenship, and nationality. This presentation, like my dissertation, builds upon important work of many scholars, but is distinct in many ways. My work builds upon and contributes to the existing historiography on citizenship, immigration, Black intellectualism, and national identity formation. However, it is unique. First, Black immigration is centrally placed into the early 20th century American immigration narrative. Furthermore, my work gives equal attention to the movements of Southern migrants and Black immigrants to New York City, while exploring similarities and differences between the two migrations. And that's really specific because most people don't put these two migrations in the same history and give equal attention to both. Finally, and this is the focus of today's presentation, my research discusses the Black immigrants' experience in relation to the experience of African Americans, because the immigrants too influenced American culture, shaped Black political life in the early 20th century, and defined what it meant to be Black in America. Now I'll provide you with some background information. This is a map of the Caribbean. I pretty much focus on Caribbean immigrants that came from the British West Indies or the British-speaking Caribbean. This whole area also composes the Spanish-speaking Caribbean and other areas as well, and black immigrants migrated from the entire Caribbean, but because the majority came from the British-speaking Caribbean, that's where I focus. And once I'm done with my dissertation and move on to the next stage, I will include these other people. For instance, Arthur Schomburg of the Schomburg Research Center came from Puerto Rico, so he came from the Spanish-speaking Caribbean, but I don't discuss these immigrants from the other areas, only the immigrants from the British-speaking Caribbean. So I'll give you some background information. During the late 19th, during the late 19th and early 20th century, Great Britain counted within its empire several islands in the Caribbean. The region is referred to variously as the British Caribbean, the English-speaking Caribbean, and the British West Indies. Residents of these islands participated in national and international migrations, both involuntarily as part of the British colonial empire in Americas during their slave era, and voluntarily as they were emancipated yet remained British colonists. The first wave of voluntary Caribbean migration started in the 1830s. The migrants, similar to African Americans during the Emancipation era, fled plantations searching for their employment in towns. While many traveled within their birth colony, others ventured further afield within the British Caribbean, especially to Trinidad and British Guyana. These islands were popular destinations for those who hoped to find better employment opportunities. The second wave of migration from 1885 to the 1920s included movements within the British-held islands, the Caribbean, and internationally. Specifically, Cuba and the Dominican Republic in the Spanish-speaking Caribbean, Panama and Costa Rica in Central America, as well as the United States pulled immigrants en masse. As a result, America received its first large-scale voluntary immigration of people of African descent in the post-emancipation era. You can go to the next slide. A small yet significant percentage of the immigrants from the British Caribbean lived in Central or South America before their departure for the United States. Specifically, during the construction of the Panama Canal, Panama attracted many cosmopolitan islanders who subsequently used their Panama money to migrate to and settle in the U.S. Amy Ashwood, the first wife of Marcus Garvey and co-founder of the Universal Negro Improvement Association, moved to Panama City with her parents during a critical period of the canal's construction. Her father, Michael Ashwood, opened a catering company and restaurant to feed the Caribbean immigrants who built the canal. As he accumulated wealth, Amy returned to Jamaica. In 1918, she moved to New York City, which housed the largest foreign-born black population in America, where she reunited with Marcus Garvey, who had also lived in Panama and other countries. Amy Ashwood is an example of the cosmopolitan black immigrant, and the organization that she co-founded greatly shaped African American politics. She also lived in Panama, where Caribbean immigrants interacted with African Americans and experienced American-style Jim Crow before they actually lived in America. You can change it. This slide is of a picture of a banana boat from the United Fruit Company. The United Fruit Company really developed within this area during this time period, during the 1890s to 1930s. Previously, sugar was the major crop, or the major way that people made money in most of the islands. There was a decrease in sugar production and an increase in the development of bananas, and the banana boat trade from the Caribbean islands to the United States really increased the immigration from the Caribbean islands to the United States, because people often moved on the banana boats. So now I'm going to discuss the movement to the United States. Many factors pushed the British Caribbean immigrants from their respective homelands to places such as Panama and the United States during the early 20th century. Hardships plagued the islands. A significant decline in profits from the production of sugar, the major staple crop of many of the colonies, led to a decrease in employment opportunities and a general decline in the economies. The economic turmoil led to class struggles, with an increase in disparities between the rich and the poor. To add to their troubles, hurricanes, floods, and droughts frequently troubled the Caribbean islands between 1880 and 1920. In addition, political factors pushed the immigrants. Jamaicans, who became the largest British Caribbean ethnic group in America, experienced severe economic hardships as well as natural disasters that ravaged the islands in general. The growth of the United Fruit Company had devastating effects as well. Cycles of droughts followed by hurricanes dogged Jamaica. The harsh weather often created food shortages and hunger ran rapid. Jamaicans and British colonists looked to the United States. During this time, America was experiencing economic expansion due to industrialization and eventually World War I era prosperity that pulled the migrants. Over 100,000 fled the British Caribbean, hoping to take advantage of America's change in fortune. According to historian Winston James, this American migration increased dramatically from a trickle of 411 in 1899 to a flood of 12,243 per year by 1924. While World War I and restriction laws slowed the massive flow of immigrants from Europe during the early 20th century, immigration from the British Caribbean continued. During this era, New York City was the most popular destination for the immigrants, followed by Boston, Massachusetts, and Miami, Florida. Previously, Miami, Florida held the largest black immigrant population in the United States, but as black Southerners moved further north, so too did the Caribbean immigrants. This wave from the Caribbean receded in 1925 when legislation placed quota on the number of foreigners allowed to enter the United States from the British colonies, and some even returned in the 1930s during the Great Depression. It is important to note that while some scholars discuss World War I prosperity as the major pull factor to the United States, this wave of immigration began way before the start of the war. The final half of this immigration occurred during the early years of America's Great Migration. Over 6 million black Southerners spread across the North and West from World War I era until the return migrations in the 1970s. Southern migrants who participated in the southeastern streamboard of the Great Migration fled from the states of Georgia, Florida, Virginia, and the Carolinas to the major cities of Washington, Philadelphia, New York, and Boston. As previously mentioned, a significant population of black immigrants lived in New York and Boston as well. There, both the migrants and immigrants shaped the new urban environments. Can you change? This is a map of Harlem and how the black population was changing during the time period. So you see the small concentration of black people in 1913, and you see it growing in 1920, and it's even larger in the 1930s. Specifically in New York City, available housing pulled this ethnically diverse black population to San Juan Hill and the Tenderloin sections of Manhattan before they moved on to Harlem during the World War I decade. Sections of Brooklyn housed blacks as well. Within these cramped, overpopulated, and racially segregated spaces, migrants and immigrants interacted. Their complicated relationships varied and at times included ethnic distancing or collaboration. Within these spaces, the Southern migrants and Caribbean immigrants shaped politics and cultures, and some immigrants became American. You can change the slide. This is just the top portion of a petition for naturalization for James S. Watson, and I'll talk about him shortly. I also have his oath to petition where he has to swear off allegiance to the British Crown and swear his allegiance to the United States. Post-emancipation laws and amendments not only define the rights and legal citizenship status for African American, these gendered and racialized laws also defined the pathway to naturalize American citizenship for the black migrants who grappled with their legal status. In 1868, the ratification of the 14th Amendment changed the requirements for formal American citizenship. Before the passage of the amendment, U.S. residents classified as white qualified for citizenship, and only white immigrants qualified as applicants for naturalization. The 14th Amendment extended citizenship to non-whites with the statement, all persons born or naturalized within the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States. However, the right to naturalize was not a guarantee for blacks or other non-whites born outside of the United States hoping to immigrate and naturalize in this country. The status of black immigrants remained in limbo until 1870, when an amendment to the Naturalization Law of 1790 granted blacks the right to become naturalized citizens in the United States. These laws controversially neglected to allow naturalization for Asian immigrants. Blackness or whiteness became a prerequisite for American naturalization. The status of those who were deemed in between remained in limbo. Black and white were also fluid racial categories, as the American judicial system struggled to adopt a strategy to clearly define who was black and who was white as racial categories. Therefore, the 14th Amendment and the adoption of the naturalization law opened the door for a more diverse group of American nationals to include men, women, and children of African descent. However, legal scholar Devin Carbado noted that American citizenship did not guarantee or equate to an American identity or even equal treatment in this country. You can go to the next slide. In his autobiography, A Long Way from Home, Jamaican poet Claude McKay described how he benefited from his foreign status while in America. In 1918, McKay worked on a railroad and ventured off during a stop in Pittsburgh, Ohio. The city's police were combing the area for World War I draft dodgers and arrested anybody who did not have proof of registration. McKay was arrested. Subsequently, he waited in a Pittsburgh courtroom to appear before a judge. He noticed the judge handed out 5 and 10-day sentences like they were souvenirs. Eventually, he pled his case. According to McKay, as soon as I had finished, the judge asked me if I were born in Jamaica. I said, yes, sir, and he commented, nice place. I was there a couple years ago. The judge dismissed McKay's case and reprimanded the arresting officer for not being discriminate. After the show of leniency, McKay requested a letter to verify his wrongful detainment. Very willingly, claimed McKay, the judge obliged me and dictated a letter to the clerk, which he signed. So excellent was the paper that the judge gave me, I was able to use it for the duration of the war without worrying about a new registration card. The Americans arrested with McKay served 5 and 10-day sentences. Following his experience with the American judicial system, McKay cultivated his Jamaican accent to further distance himself from African Americans. Ironically, his immigrant status led to preferential treatment. Overall, many black foreigners believed that they had more rights, not just privileges, in America than African Americans, and therefore wanted to remain foreigners in America. I actually plan to further explore the rights of black British nationals in comparisons to the rights of African Americans during this time period. Conversely, some immigrants from the English-speaking Caribbean naturalized to attain the rights and benefits of American citizenship. Some of these benefits included voting, increased availability of housing, and decreased fear of deportation. McKay eventually became an American citizen in 1940. Cyril Critchlow, once a prominent member of Garvey's UNIA, who was born in the British Caribbean, naturalized in 1919 during an era of heightened anti-immigrant sentiments. Critchlow's family also underscores a gendered component of legal status. According to the Expatriation Act of 1907, women who married a foreigner lost their American citizenship. For instance, if an African American woman married a Jamaican immigrant, her legal status changed as she transitioned from single to married. The citizenship status of men did not change with marital status. The 1920 federal census record for Lillian Critchlow, the American-born wife of Cyril Critchlow, reflected this predicament. Although her census records noted her birthplace as New Jersey, she was also listed as a naturalized citizen in 1919, the year of her husband's naturalization. According to American law, Lillian Critchlow lost her American citizenship and assumed the status of her husband when they married during the early 20th century. Likewise, Lillian Critchlow became a naturalized American citizen when her husband naturalized. However, the Cable Act of 1922 overturned the Expatriation Act, and marital status no longer changed the citizenship status of women. Therefore, during the early 20th century, citizenship was fluid for American women who assumed the status of their husband. While we know that American women fought to overturn this Expatriation Act of 1907, I will continue to look to see if black immigrants also fought to overturn these laws, which would help them as well. Overall, American citizenship, which was gendered and racialized, guaranteed neither equal treatment nor preferential treatment over foreign-born people of African descent. Immigrants also experience both benefits and detriments of their status. Go to the next slide. Political power is typically seen as one of the greatest benefits of American citizenship. However, black immigrants of various legal status shaped political life in early 20th century New York. Marcus Garvey of Jamaica never naturalized and was one of the most influential political figures in America. In Jamaica, he organized the United Negro Improvement Association, which flourished in America, and he influenced people to support his Back to Africa movement. According to the Garvey Papers, it was in America that Garvey struggled and succeeded in making his lasting political mark, the effects of which were profound and would ramify throughout the black world. Here in America, he achieved his greatest renown as a black leader and created for himself a legend as a Moses of his race. Africa was his ultimate goal, but it was in America that he supplied the platform and organizational means. While Garvey's influence is widely explored, his fellow Jamaican, James S. Watson, exemplifies how the Caribbean presence in America influenced mainstream electoral politics during the early 20th century, which is a topic that is less explored. Can you change the slide? From 1890 until the 1910s, many black Americans in New York City felt an allegiance to the Republican Party, the party of Abraham Lincoln. Jamaicans in New York City did not feel such an obligation to this party. As the immigrant population increased, blacks slowly began to support Democratic candidates. In 1930, James S. Watson ran for a municipal judgeship in Harlem on the Democratic ticket. Harlem held a black majority and New York City had never elected a black judge. Beyond his race, Watson was not a typical candidate for many reasons. He was born on May 29, 1882 in Spanish Town, Jamaica, where he received his early education. Subsequently, he briefly worked as clerical staff. However, Watson migrated to and arrived in New York City on June 7, 1905. 8 years after his arrival, he became a naturalized American citizen. In America, he earned a law degree and practiced law for many years before his hard-fought battle for the municipal judgeship in New York City. During this campaign, his supporters appealed to race consciousness as they addressed African Americans' loyalty to the Republican Party. They campaigned with the slogan, "Put race loyalty ahead of party loyalty." Their campaign document stated, "We address ourselves to colored voters, but to those voters only who put their race above their party, who believe that the interest and welfare of colored Americans is paramount above the interest and welfare of any political party." Watson's citizenship status and plight in America was discussed during the campaign as well. His volunteer staff mailed letters to voters to assure the voters of Watson's success in the upcoming election, even though he was a naturalized citizen. And in these letters you see where they discuss how people don't think a naturalized citizen will win the election, but they're assuring him he will win. Furthermore, the New York Defender quoted Watson during his election as saying, "Would you believe that I only became a citizen in 1913? The article continues, "Then he, Watson, explained to his friend that there was no other country in the world in which he could have made the rapid advancement which he had as a colored man except in America," which sounds like a politician to me. At a time when many African Americans supported Republican candidates, the Democrat Watson won his election and became the first black man elected to a judgeship in New York City. Watson noted that West Indians did their duty to see him elected. And I actually chose this photograph because you see Watson running, and there's also this image of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who's running for governor at this time. And so we usually think of black people switching to the Republican Party during the presidential election. And so I see where a lot of scholars will say, well, actually a lot of scholars don't talk about Watson, but the few who do mention how he helped bring Caribbean immigrants and African Americans to the Republican Party before Roosevelt in 1932. But he's actually running on this at the same time as Roosevelt was governor of New York City. So I'm going to explore that a little further as well. Go to the next. Oh no, not yet. sorry. American also supplied the platform for writers and literary artists who participated in the early 20th century wave of immigration. Migrants and immigrants interacted in New York City, where they expressed and published their feelings regarding race, identity, and citizenship status. Their published expressions resonated nationally and globally. Black journalists, native and foreign-born, wrote for newspapers consumed by blacks throughout the country, such as Garvey's Negro World, and publications edited by Claude McKay. Furthermore, black migrants and immigrants in New York City birthed the Harlem Renaissance. Continue now. Some of the most prominent writers of the Harlem Renaissance were either migrants or immigrants in New York. Langston Hughes of Missouri published the Renaissance-era poem entitled I Too Am America. Hughes' dear friend, the talented and charming Zora Neale Hurston, was born in Alabama and famously lived in Edenville, Florida, before she migrated to New York. Her literary works, such as Their Eyes Were Watching God, resonated with audiences. Finally, the aforementioned Claude McKay published many pieces that resonated with Harlemites and blacks throughout the world. In 1919, he published If We Must Die. He concluded this poem with, like men will face the murderous, cowardly pack, pressed to the wall, dying but fighting back. This poem emerged during the same year as major race riots in the United States. New Yorkers lived through horrific race riots in 1900 and 1905 as well. McKay's experiences in Jamaica and his migration and experience in America influenced this poem and exemplify how migrations and interethnic interactions influenced artists of the Harlem's Renaissance. His fellow Jamaicans and immigrants from the greater British Caribbean left their mark on the American economy, social life, as well as other forms of culture and politics not mentioned in this presentation. An abundance of literature exists on the post-1965 wave of black immigration to America that underscores that blacks in America are neither culturally nor ethnically homogenous, as well as politically and culturally influential. However, it's important to lay the historical foundation for this important conversation and to examine black Caribbean immigration, American citizenship, politics and cultures during the early 20th century. British Caribbean immigrants, too, became a part of the first black industrial working class in America, shaped black cultural and political life, as well as defined what it meant to be black in America. Thank you. Questions or comments? Yeah.
I actually was thinking in your talk, I really loved your talk.
Thank you.
But I was thinking about the last thing you said during your talk, which was about the industrial working class.
Yes.
You discuss in your broader work labor and working class dynamics.
Yeah, that's actually the major focus of my major work. I really don't talk about culture as much as I talk about politics, their political identity and their economic identity, so the labor, and this discussion of both black Southerners and people in the Caribbean moving to the industrial American North, that they become industrial workers. And many of the Caribbean immigrants, I'm not finished yet, so I haven't done all the research, especially in this is my last chapter. I'm talking about their economic identity in New York City, but it looks like for a lot of the Caribbean immigrants who I do know were extremely literate, and a lot of them had very good jobs when they came to America, but it seems as they keep coming, they become agricultural worker and they get lower paying jobs as well. So you see, it seems to me like when I'm discussing this becoming African American story, they're starting to have the same jobs as African Americans, even though they were better educated and more literate. And I also like to look at the similarities and differences between the types of work they were doing before they left, and a comparison to what's going on in this new world and in this new environment, because it's very different going from working the land and being an agricultural worker and then working in the industrial north. Yeah.
So there were businesses that hired black?
There were businesses, and so there were businesses that hired African Americans.
Factories and stuff?
Yeah, well, especially during World War I, when you need laborers to work in the industrial. And so this is why people started. The migration's already started, but people are coming to America to get these jobs that white males had, but now they're fighting in the war. So yes, they were hired during this time period, but there's a discussion of how a lot of the Jamaican immigrants were extremely educated and literate, and people like James S. Watson who go to college and he earns a law degree and becomes a lawyer. And so there's a discussion of them as sort of being this black middle class, but you also see a lot of them, even though they are literate and educated, getting these not black middle class type jobs, like working class type jobs.
During that era, the teachers, were the differential patterns, or maybe there weren't differential patterns for men and women.
You said, were there differential and patterns of what? Of the migration?
Yeah, for men and women.
Yeah, yes. Okay, so New York City is very interesting because you actually get more women in New York City than men. And so there's actually more black men migrating from the Caribbean. But in New York City, you get more black women than men. And they usually tie it back to what I can see to the occupations, jobs. Women can get jobs in New York City at this time period, but they're usually like domestic service type jobs. Black Caribbean women were able to get to like seamstress and do jobs that are really like black middle class type jobs as well. But there is a difference, and they connect to the fact that women were able to work and like as domestic servants during this time period. And if you look at other cities, if you look at other cities in the Midwest where you have a Caribbean immigrant, there's a larger male population. And even when I'm reading a lot during this time period, there's everybody in their primary sources, secondary sources talk about there's just this abundance of women, whether they're from the South or from the Caribbean in New York City. Any other questions? Yes.
Could you tell us a little bit about your methodology and your sources? Did you start kind of in the 30s and work backwards with a pool of people that you'd identified, or did you start with immigration records and sort of build forward, or how did you go about putting your story together?
I actually started, like you said, in like the 1930s. I became interested when I was reading during this time period, like 1920s, Harlem Renaissance. In my mind, and this isn't really in my dissertation, but I thought, what's going on is this clash of culture. So you get these black immigrants and you have these African Americans, and they're discussing identity, and they're looking at each other and they're discussing identity and they're discussing citizenship status, and there's all these cultural differences, and this clash of culture out of this emerges like the Harlem Renaissance. So this is what I was thinking about, even though I don't really go into it in the dissertation. So I started in the later time period in looking at culture and political identity, but then I knew I wanted to talk about change over time, and I didn't want to know too much about what's going on. I wanted to start at the beginning. So then I went back and really, like right now, I'm really looking at these sources like 1890s, 1900s, and I'm trying not to even look at the later sources, which I have a lot of information because there's more there. There's more about the Harlem Renaissance. The Caribbean immigrants were extremely literate. They were more literate than even white Americans, and so they're prolific writers. And so there's a lot of sources during that time period that I'm looking forward to really looking at. But right now I need to focus on this earlier time period and look at like census records, and because I do a lot with census records and newspaper articles, I'm really focusing on like the politics and what type of labor they're doing and how they discuss their labor during this time period. Yeah. Yes.
Well, I want to contribute to your research and tell you that my ancestors came over from the West Indies.
Oh, wow, okay.
And they were red caps and stuff. So I don't know how much their education was, but I do see that, the father was it, the children were working at the railroad, the cousins were working at the railroad.
Right, and Claude McKay worked on the railroad. That story I'm telling you, he was working on the railroad and he had to stop in Pittsburgh when he's arrested. So there's all type of different, yeah.
So that's why I was interested in the factory part and wondering why my ancestors didn't go for the factory. I guess they must have made enough money at the railroad.
Yeah.
A couple of the major books on this period in New York and African Americans, of like Khalil Gibran Muhammad and Cheryl Hicks's work.
Yes, yes,
about
yeah.
Criminalization.
Yes.
And I was just wondering if I know that this is like a strand of the whole experience, but whether there were differential like patterns of criminalization, or it was Claude McKay's experience more common?
That's okay, and so that's another thing that I'm looking at, because this also gets into this discussion about whether they have more rights, British nationals. So I've seen where people said that the British immigrants had the protection of the British consulate, and so they would always say, I'm going to the consulate, and the consulate helped them during this time period. And I don't know to what extent, but yeah, and so there is a difference there in how they're treated because they're not. And some people say that's part of the reason why they did not want to become American citizens, because they wanted that protection of the British consulate. And at times it's better for them to identify as immigrants. At times it's better to say, well, I'm like these African Americans. But there is a discussion about, you know, being protected under the British Crown. But I don't know to what extent. And then I see an irony between that, is that a lot of the British Caribbean immigrants were also soldiers during World War I, and they were treated horribly by the British government during this time period as they fought in the war. So that's part of the reason why they want to immigrate to America, and then once they get there, it's like, oh, let me go to my consulate for protection from what's going on here. So there is a difference, and I'm not sure to what extent yet, but I'm definitely interested in that, because I do see where people say they have more rights, and I don't know to what extent, and if that's even true. Yeah.
I'm noticing that when you discuss the British immigrants, that it seems as though they have like this binary identity that they can transform from being a British immigrant to being like those of African Americans. And so like, how does I know you talked about naturalization, but how does I guess like the identity account when you're describing these immigrants and the localization of I'm in New York City as a British immigrant, but at the same time I can identify, or I could say I'm an American also. I don't know if that's it.
Yeah, well, okay, so there's two things. One is I'm looking at whether or not even the citizenship, how much having this citizenship really matters, like becoming an American citizen. And so a lot of people who are migrating are doing so because they need better opportunities, especially when it comes to economic opportunities. And so it's kind of, you do what you have to do, what's most advantageous for you. So if at a certain time period, do you think it's going to help you to, like Claude McKay said, you know, to cultivate his British accent during that time period, he's going to be an immigrant. But then in 1940, he naturalizes and becomes African American. So people are just doing they're looking out for their best interest. And at certain times, like post World War I, when we have this anti-immigrant sentiment, it's better to identify with African Americans if you can. I mean, there are clearly differences between the two, and there's tensions amongst the groups, and sometimes there's collaboration. But it seems like everybody's doing what's best for them at the time period. So if at a certain time it's better for me to try to identify with African Americans, I'll do that. And if it's better for me to be an immigrant or to have my British accent, then I'll do that. But you're doing what's in your best interest. And I also, you know, when I read James Watson with his statements of how this can only happen in America, a lot of it, you know, you can tell like this is what he should say because he's running for election. You know, so he's going to do what's helpful to him. And there's also a discussion about whether or not the immigrants should naturalize to help and vote during the elections during this time period.
So, have there developed in a pan-West Indian identity, separate from the different national identities?
Right. It seems to me that there becomes an sort of in America makes sort of this West Indian identity. Like they're identified as these black immigrants and not really seen as different. But there are, you know, they do attach and they know about their differences. And I really think like if you look at Garvey's movement, there's a lot of different people from different islands or different colonies from the British Caribbean within that organization. And so I feel like it's sort of placed on them, and this, you know, this pan-West Indian identity.
Were there societies?
Yeah, they did. They clearly had each colony had their own organization where they would help people come. They so each had their own organization. So you have like the specific organization for Jamaica, but then you also have British West Indian organizations as well. And James S. Watson was over British West Indian organizations, and they talk about what terms they should use, like what we should call ourselves. Should we talk about West Indian? Should we use black? You know, talk about the different colonies we're coming from. So once again, it's, you know, what's in our best interest. They're constantly thinking about. But yeah, you have the different organizations for every islander, and they have these benevolent societies that are helping people to come over, and people go to these benevolent societies and go to meetings and congregate together. But then also you have broader organizations, and you really see it with James S. Watson's campaign, because he's working with a lot of West Indians. just interesting to me because he talks about how West Indians helped him to get elected, but I'm not sure in what aspect, because I'm not sure if they're voting or if they're just campaigning, or to what extent.
One demonstration of how residual a lot of that stuff is, we've published newsletters for what used to be the Center for African American Studies here, and in the late 80s, we started using the term African American as descriptive of people of African descent in the Western Hemisphere. And a group of Jamaicans in Florida took serious objection to that and threatened to sue me personally for using that term to describe them in our newsletter.
Oh my gosh.
What did they want to be called?
Jamaicans?
Jamaicans. Yeah. Jamaicans.
Jamaican Americans or just Jamaican immigrants? Or something?
Well, I'm not sure that they made that distinction so much, that they certainly didn't want to be subsumed under the term African American. That was clear. And the next time we used it, there'd be trouble.
And I think another thing that's related to that as well is the, not necessarily racial classification, but the complexion. The way they look at complexion is very different in the islands. And so a lot of these West Indians, when they came to America, all of a sudden they became black. They're like, no, I'm not black. I'm near white, like they were in the islands, but in America they became black as well. But a lot of them are trying to say, I'm not black either. I'm not African American, I'm not black. Yes?
Yeah, this is an interesting topic. And as you recall earlier, Corey, I think that's a lot of what you're talking about when you start looking at the political structure of Jamaicans and what was the other Trinidadian. So maybe you have to weigh in.
No, in terms of the historical components, I think there's sort of pulling out some of the same types of ideas
Right.
that I'm really interested in as well.
Right. And you talk about not necessarily electoral politics, but how they're politically active, and that's even if you're not voting, and I think that's very important during this time period as well. Yeah. Good.
Could you talk more about, and apologies if I missed this, if you've already covered it, but how they were treated by whites, the difference between how African Americans and Caribbeans might have been treated by whites who knew the difference?
Who knew? What do you
Who
mean?
knew the difference between? And I'm vaguely remembering a conversation we had once about how I think it might have been someone who was arrested even.
Yeah.
Treated differently. Okay.
Yeah, and I think it once again goes back to things are changing at different time periods, but at certain time periods it seems like British Caribbean immigrants are really holding on to their British Caribbean identity because they felt like they're treated better by the white society, not necessarily African Americans, because there can be tensions there when you're saying I'm not black like you. You're intentionally distancing yourself because it helps you with within the broader community within America. But at times it's better to do that, and then at other times it's better for them to sort of identify with African Americans. And yeah, there's differential treatment towards the immigrants, but it's not always preferential treatment. Like I did use that one example from Claude McKay, but it's not always preferential treatment because you're an immigrant at all. So okay.
I don't know if you've got a chance to, but I'm really interested in this component that you raised about that relationship between African Americans and Caribbeans. Have you, and I don't know if you've sort of gone on the other side, because I too have tried to focus my attention on Caribbean immigrants as opposed to African American response specifically, because that can be a sort of interesting project in and of itself.
Right.
What have you found in terms of their response to the Caribbean?
Once again, it changes over time, but there's a lot of tension when the Caribbean immigrants are really trying to distance themselves and say, I'm not African American. And there's complaints about how they are trying to hide under the British consulate. And I guess that was a term a lot of them would say, like, I'll go to the consulate, and African Americans were talking. Yeah, and and African Americans did not like that they would say this. So there is a sort of a negative response, but at times, and I mean, I've heard Bobby Hill talk about Garvey and the UNIA, and there's lots of African Americans in that organization. I mean, this is the biggest black political movement during the early 20th century, and you have these Caribbean immigrants and you have African Americans in this movement together. So you clearly have collaboration during this time period, and I think Bobby Hill does a really great job is talking about it's after Garvey's imprisonment that sort of African Americans relate to him because he was imprisoned, and then all of a sudden it becomes more, and we even talk about it more as this African American movement, but before this time it was seen as this West Indian movement. But there's something about that experience of him being in prison, and black people can, we know about that, and they really identified more with this movement. And I think of Devin Carbottle's Racial Naturalization when he talks about how you have these experiences in America where you realize who you are, like you're racially naturalized. And so like a Garvey's imprisonment would be like, oh, you're now a black American. Whether you're a citizen or not, you're treated like black Americans. Yeah, sure.
Just, this isn't a question, but it's more of a comment about like the intervention, which I think is so big, because so much of this history, particularly in a place like New York, is around whiteness studies and class formation.
Yeah, I want to do
and
black.
you're like really showing the complexity of like blackness as a construct.
Yes.
And how like black people are negotiating that.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah, that's what
challenging it, and so.
Yeah, that's what I want to contribute to, sort of this construction of their new identity, and this, and getting away from the whiteness and back into blackness, and the differences, the nuances of the black identity during this time period. And I also see it in relation to like these becoming American stories. Like I think this is also becoming an American story. You have these people naturalizing. It's just a little bit after 14th Amendment when African Americans are citizens, and so I think it's definitely. And I can take any comments, not just questions, because this is a work in progress. So if anybody has any comments for me, that's good as well. Yeah.
There's a book called Passing Strange. I don't know if you've heard of it.
I haven't
White
read
guy
it.
trying to pass for black.
Oh.
And he married this black woman, and yet he had his own professional life in the white world, and he was in New York, as a matter of fact.
Oh.
And there were times when he was trying to say he was West Indian.
Really?
He worked for the railroad. That's why that was his thing to explain his time away from the black family. And he was saying he got treated better as a white person, passing for a black person.
No.
He said he was from the West Indies.
Oh, okay, so he's saying West Indians were treated even better than white people.
Yes.
Oh, well, that's interesting.
A few little paragraphs or something.
That's interesting. Yeah.
What you said about people from the West Indies being more educated,
Yes.
that now is helping me understand something in theater, because in the 1820s, the first black theater company that was doing Shakespeare plays was started by someone who was West Indian.
Oh, wow.
And so I was always thinking, this is odd that they're doing Shakespeare, but now it makes
Oh, no.
sense.
And they love reading. There's this love for reading from the British Caribbean immigrants. Which when I'm reading, people are saying this is cultural. Like they love to read, even if they're not still in school. There's just a love for books and for reading. And like I don't know if I said this during the presentation, but they're more literate as well. More literate than any immigrant group. More literate than white Americans. This immigrant group.
Well, I was told to this day that the West Indians have higher SAT scores and all the other little testing things than regular black Americans for the most part.
I don't know about West Indians, but I believe Africans test. Is that true? Do you know? I believe Africans have the highest test rates in any.
But who are the immigrants too?
Right, immigrants, African immigrants. Yes, immigrants. Yeah.
Right. The people who come tend to be most educated.
Right. Absolutely. Right. And even with this group, like I mentioned, people going to Cuba and other colonies during this time period, and for some reason they're saying the better educated people came to America. I'm not sure why yet, and so people who weren't as educated might have gone to Cuba and other places during this, but I'm not sure.
Brain training.
Yeah, yes, yeah, yes.
Were African Americans that had migrated to Harlem also trying to negotiate an overall identity? Were they identifying as like, well, I'm from Louisiana or I'm from Alabama, or as West Indians were from Jamaica or from a different place? Were there those tensions as well within the African American community? Do you get into that, or is it them as one?
I know there's definitely like chain migration, so where people are, and so like people who are coming from the same areas are migrating to the same places. And so they do stay within their pockets, within their communities, within the African American communities as well, for the Southern migrants during this time period. Yeah, and so in a similar way where there's different migration streams, where people from Florida and Georgia and the Carolinas are going to New York, even within New York, people are staying like with family members and are going to the same places in their churches. They talk about a lot of churches moving from the South to maybe like New York City and the same membership going to the same church once they arrive in New York.
So how does that impact how you talk about sort of navigating identity? You've got these two groups, one migrant, one immigrant, and they're both
very complex.
Like they're dealing with similar things in that they're both navigating if they belong to a larger group,
right,
or a smaller group, or the overall broad group, and how does that all work out?
Well, for my research, when I get into identity, I'm looking more towards like their labor. What are they doing? So I'm not sort of seeing how they're identifying with people from the same state, but what type of occupations they end up going to, and then their political identifications as well. So I'm really kind of focused on this economic and political identity, and then sort of the broader question of British Caribbean immigrants, whether or not they're sort of distancing themselves from African American, but I don't get sort of in a smaller.
Well, does the labor market or the political identification, does it have anything to do with where people are from? Their group? Like, is that a connection you've come across, or I mean, it might be too difficult.
Do you mean within? Do you mean whether they're Caribbean immigrants, or you mean from states or from different colonies?
From specific places, either African Americans or the immigrants.
Yes. So, and there's a whole Winston James writes. He writes about the Caribbean immigrants, and so he's engaging in this discussion about the radicalism of these Caribbean immigrants, and they're talking about political radicalization, and he's arguing against this notion that in America a lot of these Caribbean immigrants become more radical, and saying that the radicalism starts in the Caribbean and they bring it with them to the United States. So these Caribbean immigrants are seen as more radical. That's why I'm trying to talk about James S. Watson, who's mainstream. So I'm trying to sort of navigate that area to add something to the scholarship. So we know a lot about Marcus Garvey, and Winston James wrote this great book on the radicalism of Caribbean immigrants, and maybe you would think of switching African Americans from the Republican Party to the Democratic as radical as well. But I'm trying to look at how they have this influence in mainstream politics. But yeah, there are differences in how the Caribbean immigrants think about politics in the United States and how African Americans think about politics in the United States. Okay.
Did marriage exist between these two cultures?
Yeah, there was intermarriage. I don't know to what extent, and that's something I'm looking for. I'm trying to go through census records. Like I talked about how if an African American woman married an immigrant, they lost their citizenship status. So I would think that would be a deterrent. And they also talk about during this time period how a lot of people considered themselves married, but they weren't legally married, and so there might not be records or anything. But there was intermarriage between African Americans, and I guess you're probably thinking, of course, but I just don't know to what extent yet. But I do plan to look into that. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.